Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, we are going to talk about the fight to lead the House Foreign Affairs Committee and how that leadership role could impact U.S. foreign policy. This is happening because a friend of the pod, Jamal Bowman, defeated the current committee chairman, Eliot Engel. Engel was viewed by many people, including us, as being too conservative. He had voted for the Iraq War. He opposed the Iran nuclear deal. He was generally hawkish. That was a big part of why he lost, I believe, and people wanted Bowman's more progressive foreign policy. Now the race is on to see who will succeed him. The Washington Post reported that Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas is going to jump into the race for this chairmanship. That is a race that already includes Greg Meeks, congressman from New York, and Brad Sherman from California. 60 progressive groups sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi recently asking her to end what they believe is a disconnect between the committee's leadership and then the progressive foreign policy consensus opinion. Specifically, this letter wants the next chairman to do the following: repeal the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, rein in intelligence collection, emphasize diplomatic and not military solutions to problems, oppose regime change, oppose sanctions that are overly onerous on just regular people, push to end the Israeli occupation by using incentives and pressure, more scrutiny for arms sales, focus on workers in these trade deals that happen, reject special interest money, and welcome refugees. It's a good list. It's a great letter. The Washington Post describes the process to figure out who's the chairman as a mix of seniority, popularity, and backroom deal making, which sounds about right to me. So basically, what's happening now is critics are arguing that Brad Sherman is a little too similar to Engel. He's too conservative. Sherman voted for the Iraq War. He opposed the Iran nuclear deal. Greg Meeks would be the first African-American to chair the committee. He opposed the Iraq War, and he supported the Iran deal. Castro, the most recent entrant, is the least senior candidate in the running. He's put an emphasis on, including underrepresented voices in the debates, especially Palestinians. Ben, what do you make of this leadership fight, and how big an impact do you think the chairman of a House committee will actually have on U.S. foreign policy?
So I think it's hugely important. I'm really excited we're talking about it because it's not just about this committee. I think it's about the Democratic Party's approach to foreign policy writ large. And, the reality is, for far too long, the party treated foreign policy, if it wasn't in power, if there wasn't a Democratic president, Congress kind of dealt with it as like constituency issue. The progressives were generally disengaged from foreign policy, and you had people, like Engel, very tied to specific issues. He was, basically cast himself as a pro-Israel guy. He was basically a reliable AIPAC vote. And those are the kinds of things the committee did. They did resolutions on Israel, resolutions on BDS. They were, not supportive of the Iran deal, as you said. And it was kind of like a strange dynamic where the party's voters and even the caucus writ large didn't see itself reflected in the leadership of not just this committee, by the way. Same thing happened in the Foreign Relations Committee, where Bob Menendez was the lead Democrat, also reliable AIPAC vote, very focused on Israel and Iran. And I think with Jamal Bowman, friend of the pod, it's not just that those voters disagreed on foreign policy. I think it was also just like, why don't we have representatives who reflect the Democratic Party today? And so I'm so excited that progressives are building on the momentum, I think, of the last few years and getting into this fight and insisting that they're going to pay as much attention to the Foreign Affairs Committee, as they do to the committees that deal with progressive domestic issues. And the groups that sign that letter are kind of the heart of this emerging infrastructure in progressive foreign policy. On the people involved, Brad Sherman is actually the next in line in terms of seniority. He would be worse than Eliot Engel. I mean, I used to brief groups of Democratic members of Congress for the months leading up to the Iran deal and the time after. And Eliot Engel, who opposed the deal, kind of at least made a very, I think, earnest, good faith effort to try to understand what we were doing. At the end of the day, he obviously broke the wrong way, in my view. Brad Sherman was just kind of antagonistic in those briefings. Like, you could tell that this guy was going to oppose the Iran deal from the beginning. Like, he had basically a prism through which he looked at these issues, particularly issues related to Israel and Iran, that was fairly inflexible. And so I think the likelihood of Brad Sherman being chair, I think, is low. I mean, if it reflects the views of the caucus. Now, that leads to Meeks and Castro. And I think, again, both of them would be much better options than either Engel or Brad Sherman. They both bring different perspectives, both in terms of where they come from, obviously in terms of their race and ethnicity. But, Greg Meeks is focused on, I think, a pretty broad set of foreign policy issues that better reflects, frankly, what the committee should be spending its time on. Not endless fights over Israel or, scrutiny of Iran from a hawkish perspective, but, the full breadth of it. And Castro, I think, demonstrates that progressives want to get in this space, and he's more progressive voice than Meeks on certain things. And that's a good debate to have, right? A guy like Meeks, who I think is in kind of the mainstream of the party on a lot of stuff, and then Castro, who's pushing the party in a more progressive direction. So I'm excited to see how this plays out. And I think if it's one of those two guys, it's an improvement.
It is really interesting how big a tail the Jamal Bowman win has. Jamal Bowman ran on a lot of foreign policy issues, especially the question of the U.S. foreign policy relationship with Israel, especially when it comes to the occupation, especially when it comes to whether you should use only incentives or incentives and pressure as a way to encourage the Israeli government to take stances that we prefer. It does seem like that race and that victory has had a ripple effect that is, making people like Congressman Castro come out and say he wants to hear more Palestinian voices represented in the debate. It's breaking in I think, a very positive and interesting direction.
Yeah, and like I said, I think it's overdue. And part of what's so interesting is there'd been this kind of tolerance, and I put some of this on the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate, of essentially having all of these foreign policy and national security committees, largely the leadership were these kind of hawkish people, totally out of step, with Barack Obama, who I think, progressives find fault with some of Obama's foreign policy. And what the Bowman victory shows me is, look, I think some of these voters, it may not be that foreign policy was their lead concern, but I think there was a generalized sense that Eliot Engel doesn't seem to represent our district and our views. And wait a second, why did he buck Barack Obama's largest foreign policy priority in his second term? Why did he vote for the Iraq War? And so what the Democratic Party is doing is saying, and through this Bowman election, I think it demonstrates that there's a cost to people, if you don't take the views of your voters seriously. And look, the funny thing about this, the ironic thing, Tommy, is that when I was making these arguments about the Iran deal, what you would kind of hear from the DC mentality was, well, voting for the Iran deal could put someone at risk, because then AIPAC could spend money against them.
Politically,
and politically, AIPAC could spend money against them in their race, and how are they going to defend this? The interesting thing is actually the people it's put at risk are the people who oppose the Iran deal. Like, that turned out to be a more risky thing for a Democratic member of Congress to do than supporting the Iran deal. And that's a very good thing. And the reason that's happening is because progressives are insisting on it.
Yeah, go diplomacy, go progressive. This is a very good thing.